By the time Oraline Vale was led into the Hall of Judgments, she understood that humiliation could have a temperature. It was cold. It lived in the black marble under her slippers, in the silver chains of the candelabra, in the 100 silent faces lifted toward her like carved masks awaiting a sentence. The vampire court did not murmur as mortal courts did. It watched. That was worse. Watching implied patience, and patience in predators was only another shape of appetite. At the far end of the hall, upon the obsidian dais, sat King Severin of Noctes. He did not move when Oraline entered. He did not rise. He did not incline his head. The pale fire in the sconces touched the severe line of his cheekbones and the dark fall of his hair, but it could not soften him. He seemed less a man than the memory of a blade left upright in an altar stone, ancient, perfectly still. Beautiful in the way winter lakes were beautiful, clear enough to reflect the sky and cold enough to kill. Oraline kept her eyes lowered after the first glance. Her father had once told her that composure was the last inheritance a frightened girl truly owned. Her father was dead. His debts were not. His title, too diminished to shelter anyone, had passed to Oraline like a torn black ribbon. So when the summons came from Noctes, requiring the last daughter of House Vale to present herself before the king on the eve of the winter treaty, she had obeyed. Mortal border houses did not refuse vampire kings. Lady Morcant, the king's elder counselor, stepped forward in robes heavy as mourning drapery. "By custom older than the walls of this citadel," she said, her voice scraping lightly through the vast chamber, "the border daughter of House Vale is presented. Her blood sealed the first peace. Her name renews it. Let the king accept what the covenant requires." Oraline felt every eye settle on her throat. It had not been explained in plain language before she was brought there. Mortals were often spared plain language when they were being offered, yet she understood enough now. She was not merely a guest, nor even a tribute. She was a continuation. A vessel passed from agreement to agreement, as if a girl's pulse were simply another wax seal upon a political letter. She lifted her head then, not in defiance, but because silence had become more unbearable than fear. King Severin looked at her fully for the first time. There was no desire in his face, no pity. No contempt, even. Only a grave and unreadable attention that made her feel as though he were listening to something inside her blood that she herself could not hear. Then he spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying through the hall without effort. "No," the word was not loud. It did not need to be. The counselors stirred at last. Not noisily, but like wind beginning in a burial ground. Oraline's hands tightened within her sleeves. Lady Morcant blinked. "Your Majesty, I do not accept her." Oraline did not know what expression crossed her face, only that heat flooded it so suddenly she wished the marble would open and take her beneath it. Around the hall, the watching nobility sharpened into interest. Rejection was entertainment when it was not happening to oneself. Morcant recovered first. "The covenant will stand," Severin said. Without this, at last he rose. The movement was so measured it seemed ceremonial, yet something in the room recoiled. Height alone did not explain him. Power rarely did. It was the sense that everything inside him was held on an iron chain no one else could see. He descended one step from the dais and looked directly at Oraline. When he spoke again, he did not address his court. He addressed her. "You will not stand at my side. You will not be named in this hall. You are dismissed from my concern." The cruelty of it was not in the words themselves, but in their precision. He had given her back her freedom as if it were an insult, before witnesses. Before predators, Oraline bowed because there was nothing else left to do without breaking apart where she stood. "As the king commands." Her own voice, to her astonishment, did not tremble. She was escorted from the hall by servants who did not look at her. That was another indignity. Even their sympathy had been denied her. The corridor beyond the judgment chamber seemed to stretch forever, lit by wavering blue lamps and lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs who, judging by their expressions, had always expected women to suffer quietly. In the guest wing, her chamber had already been prepared for departure. That cut worst of all. They had known. Her trunk stood latched by the door. Her traveling cloak had been folded on the cedar chest at the bed's foot. Even the fire had been allowed to sink low, as if warmth would have been wasteful on a girl no longer required. Only when the maid left her alone did Oraline permit her hands to shake. She stood beside the bed and pressed her palm against her mouth. She would not cry, not here. Not in a palace that had measured her worth by blood, and then publicly denied even that. But a strange grief rose in her anyway, not for the loss of a crown she had never wanted, nor for the king's cold refusal, but for the spectacle of being made small before those who would remember it with pleasure. Outside, wind moved against the tower glass with a dry, fingernail sound. Oraline turned. Something brushed the window again, not branches. There were no trees so high against this wing. A third scrape came, longer this time, then a pause, then 3 soft taps. Her breath stalled. The curtain stirred though the casement was closed. She stepped back, pulse suddenly wild. The room felt altered, listening. The shadows at the corners seemed deeper than before, not empty but occupied. She reached for the bell rope beside the mantel. The flame in the grate went out. Not dimmed, went out. Darkness folded over the room in one soundless sweep. Oraline swallowed a cry and fumbled for the silver taper on the dressing table, but a hand closed over her wrist from behind before she found it. She froze. The hand was gloved. Cold through the fabric, but not cruel. In the blind dark, a voice near her ear said, very quietly, "Do not make a sound." She knew the voice at once. King Severin. The darkness itself seemed to gather around him. She could not see his face, only the suggestion of his height beside her and the faint gleam of one pale signet ring. Oraline tried to pull away. "You said, I know what I said." There was no apology in him, only urgency compressed into restraint. From the other side of the chamber came the sound of the latch lifting, not by servant hands. Too slow, too careful, Severin's grip tightened just enough to keep her still. "They came sooner than I expected," he murmured. Oraline's voice came thin with disbelief. "Who came?" At that, the door opened wider, and in the seam of hall light she saw not servants, not guards, but 2 tall figures in ceremonial black, their eyes faintly silver in the dark. The king's mouth lowered close to her temple. "The ones who believed my rejection meant you were unprotected." He drew her backward into the hidden shadow behind the armoire as the intruders crossed the threshold. And at last, Oraline understood that being publicly cast aside had not been the end of the night's cruelty. It had only been the invitation. Cliffhanger/emotional revelation. The king who humiliated Oraline has returned in secret, and his rejection has marked her for immediate danger. Severin moved without seeming to move at all. One moment he was beside Oraline in the narrow darkness behind the armoire. The next he was across the chamber, a black stroke through black air. One of the intruders barely had time to turn before the king's hand closed around his throat. There was no shouted command, no clash of steel. Only a brief, awful stillness, then the sound of bone meeting stone. The second figure fled toward the corridor. Severin caught him by the back of the robe and cast him against the wall hard enough to split plaster. Moonlight, leaking through the high glass, touched the king's face for the smallest instant. It was not rage that Oraline saw there. Rage would have been easier to bear. It was an old and efficient fury, cold as law and much more certain. By the time she remembered how to breathe, both men lay unconscious or dead. She could not tell. Severin could, but he did not look down. He crossed back to her and relit the fire with a strike of flint from the mantel, as if nothing in the room had changed except the arrangement of bodies. "Take your cloak," he said. Oraline stared. "You rejected me before your entire court." "Yes, and now you break into my chamber." His gaze flickered once over her face. "It was not necessary to break in. This wing was built for kings who distrusted their brides." That answer was so calm it might almost have been wit, if not for the dead men cooling on her floor. Oraline reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. "Why?" Outside the tower, bells began to sound from somewhere deep in the palace, not alarm bells precisely, something softer, rhythmic. Summoning, Severin glanced toward the door, because they will search this floor in less than 3 minutes. That is not an answer. No, he said. It is survival. He took her traveling cloak from the cedar chest and held it out. Oraline hesitated only a heartbeat before accepting it. Her hands were clumsy at the clasp. He did not assist her. For that, unexpectedly, she was grateful. Once she had drawn the hood around her hair, he stepped to the paneling beside the hearth and pressed his signet ring into a carved rosette. Wood shifted inward with a sigh of ancient mechanisms, revealing a passage narrow as a grave seam. The candlelight did not reach far into it. Oraline looked from the hidden door to the men on the floor. Are they yours? They are of my house, he said. That is not the same thing. The answer sent a chill through her greater than the dark passage did. He gestured for her to go first. Oraline obeyed because the alternative was remaining in a room where her life had already been weighed and nearly taken. The air inside the wall was damp and bitter with old mortar. Behind her, Severin sealed the panel. The sounds of the chamber disappeared at once. Only then, enclosed in stone and shadow with the very man who had cast her aside, did Oraline allow herself the sharp honesty of anger. You could have warned me. His steps were soundless behind hers. If I had warned you, you would have looked at me differently in the hall. I should hope so. In that hall, he said, everyone was watching for weakness. Oraline turned on the stair landing, nearly striking the wall in the darkness. Was I your weakness, then? He stopped below her. The narrow shaft forced them into closeness the public chamber had denied. She could not see his entire face, only the pale angle of it lifted toward hers. After a silence, he said, You were what they could use. The passage bent downward. Somewhere beneath the palace, water moved through unseen channels. Oraline descended in quiet, her anger not extinguished but altered. It was harder to direct fury at a man who had returned to save her life, though not impossible. At length, the hidden stair opened into a disused chapel carved into the cliff beneath the castle. There were no icons here, only an empty altar and a long window slit facing the moonstruck sea. Dust silvered the floor. The air smelled of old incense and salt. Severin shut the iron door behind them. This place is warded, he said. They cannot hear you here. The implication was strange enough that Oraline looked at him sharply. Hear me say what? Anything unwise. There it was again, that severe composure that made tenderness seem impossible and concern a thing too dangerous to name. He removed his gloves finger by finger, each motion exact. His hands were pale and unmarked, except for the black signet on his right hand and a thin scar crossing the left palm. Oraline should not have noticed the scar. She noticed it anyway. The court believes, Severin said, that the old covenant entitled me to claim you. Had I accepted you publicly tonight, any rival blood within the council could have contested that claim before dawn. By what means? By killing you first. The chapel went still around her. He continued with the same controlled voice. Coven law permits challenge through blood interruption. A mortal openly chosen by the throne may be lawfully struck if her protection is not sealed before sunrise. The law was designed centuries ago to prevent weak kings from using mortal marriages to secure loyalty. Now it survives only because monsters are fond of old cruelties. Oraline pressed a hand to the edge of the altar. So you humiliated me to hide me. I rejected you to keep you alive. The words entered her like winter entering a cracked window, sharp, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. Why not tell me this before the judgment? His face changed almost imperceptibly, not softening, darkening, because there are ears in this palace that feed on more than sound. And because if they believed I valued your safety, they would have cut your throat in the corridor before you reached this place. For the first time since entering the chapel, Oraline truly looked at him. Not the king in the hall, not the figure of legend shaped by rumor and distance. A man standing motionless in a forgotten sanctuary, carrying authority like a wound long since sealed over. His eyes were dark, older than dark. When they settled on her, she felt not devoured but measured, as if he were resisting some truth he had not yet decided to speak. From somewhere beyond the stone, the palace bells changed their rhythm. Severin went to the slit window and listened. Oraline's voice came quieter now. "What happens by dawn?" He did not turn. "If they fail to find you, they will accuse me. Of protecting me, yes. And if they accuse you..." At that he looked back over his shoulder. Moonlight catching one side of his face and leaving the other in shadow. "Then I will have to tell you the part that is worse." Oraline felt her pulse stumble. "Worse than murder?" His gaze lowered just once to her hands. "No," he said softly. "Worse than being rejected." He came toward her then, not touching, not near enough to threaten, yet near enough that she could feel a strange pressure in the air between them. "There is an older reason they wanted you brought to this palace." Oraline held herself still. Severin's voice fell nearly to a whisper. "And tonight, when you entered the hall, the altar beneath the throne answered your heartbeat." Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. Oraline learns the rejection was meant to save her, but her presence has awakened something ancient beneath the vampire throne. Oraline did not sleep. Even if she had been capable of forgetting the men in her chamber and the ancient thing stirring under the throne, the chapel itself would not have allowed peace. It seemed built from memory, rather than stone. The narrow window admitted a cold strip of moonlight that shifted across the floor through the hours, and each time Oraline lifted her gaze, Severin stood somewhere different within it, by the door. At the altar, motionless before the sea slit, as though he kept vigil not merely against intruders, but against time itself. He never sat. Near dawn, he placed a covered silver cup on the altar beside her untouched bread. "You should drink." Oraline looked up from the blanket she had wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "What is it?" "Water." Something in his expression suggested the king of vampires was not accustomed to being questioned over water. Yet when she lifted the lid and smelled nothing strange, he did not take offense. If anything, the smallest shadow of approval passed through his eyes. She drank because her throat was dry, and because she had begun to suspect that accepting necessities from Severin was safer than refusing them. He watched until she finished, then looked away first. That too unsettled her. Predators were not meant to grant modesty. When the bell of first gray morning sounded far above, he said, "You may ask now." Oraline set the cup down. "Ask what?" "Everything you have been trying not to ask." Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps the chapel's isolation had made ceremony feel ridiculous. Whatever the cause, the words left her without polish. "What answered my heartbeat beneath the throne?" Severin was silent for so long she thought he would not answer at all. "At the founding of Noctis," he said at last, "there was made a right between the crown and certain border bloodlines. Not prophecy, not legend, a contract. When the throne weakened and the coven fractured, a mortal bond could stabilize succession. A bride." His face became stiller, if such a thing was possible. "A vessel." The correction chilled her. "And my family?" Oraline asked. "House Vale was part of this." "Yes, my father never spoke of it. Few mortal fathers would." Oraline turned the thought over and found anger waiting beneath it. "Then I was brought here because my blood was useful." "Yes." He answered so plainly that it almost felt merciful. "Do you always speak like a sentence?" she asked. One of his brows shifted by the smallest degree. "Would you prefer I lied gently?" "No." She regretted the answer as soon as she gave it, because it invited more truth. "No, I think I would prefer the sentence." The faintest thing occurred then, not a smile. That would have been too human, too warm. But the severity about his mouth eased, like frost cracking under a distant thaw. Oraline lowered her eyes at once, disturbed by how deeply that tiny change touched her. "Was that why you looked at me as you did in the hall?" she asked. "How did I look at you?" She wished instantly she had not asked. "As though you were listening." His gaze rested on her in the dim chapel. "I was." Oraline's fingers tightened in the blanket. "To what?" "To whether the altar would wake. And if it had not, then you would have gone home insulted but alive." The answer should have relieved her. Instead, something in it struck tenderly. Not because she wanted a crown, but because there was pain in learning just how nearly one's significance had been nothing. She rose and crossed to the slit window. Below, the sea struck black rock in mute bursts of white. The dawn here never arrived in color, only in gradations of iron. "My mother used to avoid this coast," she said quietly. "Even before my father died, if the name Noctis appeared in a letter, she burned it unread." Severin's attention sharpened. "And she never told you why?" "No. Did she leave you anything?" Oraline thought of the small lacquered coffer still buried in her travel trunk, dismissed by her as a relic of womanly sentiment. A dead woman's comb, a faded handkerchief, several sealed papers too brittle to open. "A box," she said. "Nothing important." Severin turned fully toward her. "Bring it to me when we return to your rooms." The simple certainty of when startled her. "Return. You mean to take me back, for an hour?" "Long enough to recover what matters before the council turns the palace upside down. And after that," his gaze moved, not to her face, but lower, to the hollow at the base of her throat where her pulse lived. The look lasted only an instant, yet in that instant the air seemed to tighten. "After that," he said, "you go where even my court cannot easily reach." Oraline should have been comforted. Instead, a peculiar sorrow stirred in her, irrational and embarrassing. The thought of being hidden by him was easier to bear than the thought of being sent away from him. She despised herself for noticing the difference. A metallic sound broke the hush. Severin was at the chapel door in a blink. Oraline turned just as a blade slid through the narrow gap beneath the threshold, not to strike, but to hook a folded strip of parchment inward. The blade vanished. Severin stooped, picked up the message, and read. His expression did not change. That frightened her more than if it had. "What is it?" He handed her the parchment. The writing was elegant and old-fashioned. "Your Majesty, if the girl is still alive, the mark has chosen. Bring her to the Black Archive before the council learns what slept beneath your throne. E. M. Oraline looked up. "Who is E.M.?" Severin was already moving toward the extinguished candles, gathering his gloves, his cloak, his silence. "The only person in this palace," he said, "who feared what your blood would awaken more than I did." He opened the door, then paused. "Oraline." It was the first time he had spoken her name. She went still. When she met his eyes, whatever he had meant to say seemed to alter. He only extended his hand to help her over the chapel's broken threshold stone. She hesitated, then placed her fingers lightly in his palm. His hand closed around hers with grave care. On the inside of his wrist, half hidden beneath his sleeve, she saw an old blackened scar in the shape of a ring. And for no reason she could understand, terror passed through her. Cliffhanger/emotional revelation. The king says Oraline's blood has chosen, and a hidden ally summons them to the Black Archive. The Black Archive lay beneath the oldest wing of Noctis, below even the sepulchres of its dead queens. Severin did not lead Oraline through open halls this time. He took her by service stairs and shuttered galleries, through corridors where portraits had been turned to face the wall, and where ancient lamps still burned with blue witchfire. In daylight, the palace seemed emptier rather than safer. Shadows had nowhere to hide, so they settled into people. No one challenged the king. That, Oraline realized, was a different sort of horror. The servants they passed lowered their heads without surprise, as if seeing him emerge from hidden doors with a mortal woman in tow was not extraordinary enough to remark upon. Perhaps in houses like this, the extraordinary happened too often to waste reaction on. At the final iron gate, an old woman awaited them. She was slight, wrapped in severe black, with white hair braided close to her skull and a face fine as dried parchment. But her eyes, clear, pale, entirely unsentimental, took Oraline in at once. "Too young," the woman said. Severin shut the gate behind them. "That accusation is late by 2 centuries. The woman ignored him. "I am Etta Morven, keeper of the archive." "Your mother came here once," Oraline started. "You knew her. I warned her." Etta's gaze sharpened. "She chose marriage instead." Severin's jaw tightened almost invisibly, and Oraline felt the tension between them like a current drawn across old metal. The archive itself was vast and subterranean, a cathedral of shelves, reliquaries, and sealed alcoves. Dust thickened the air, though certain paths had been kept obsessively clear. At its center stood a circular table of black stone veined with silver. On it, already laid open, was a ledger bound in something darker than leather. Etta rested her thin hand upon the page. House Vale did not merely supply mortal brides to the crown. It carried the legal countermark to the king's line. The rite cannot begin unless both bloods answer. Aureline remembered Severin's gaze in the judgment hall, listening, and it answered. Etta looked at her with no softness. Yes, Severin said, show her the record. Etta turned several pages, revealing old script, names struck through, seals broken, marginal notes written in different centuries by different hands. Aureline leaned closer and found her own mother's name there. Lysen Vale. Beside it in a firmer, darker hand, refused, removed before binding. Child hidden, her breath caught. My mother was chosen. For a brief hour, Etta said. Then she fled. Aureline looked to Severin. You let her go. His face had gone remote again. I sent her away. Why? Before he could answer, the air behind them changed. Severin spun. Aureline heard only a rush as of cloth through air before one of the high glass cases shattered. 3 figures dropped from the rafters in dark coats lined with silver mesh. Not court nobles this time. These moved with mortal bluntness and trained efficiency. Hunters. One raised a compact crossbow and fired. Severin was between Aureline and the bolt before she understood what was happening, but the angle had already changed. The silver-tipped shaft struck the stone table, glanced, and cut across Aureline's palm as she threw up her hand. Pain flashed white. A single line of blood welled instantly across her skin. Everything stopped. Severin looked at the wound as though the world had narrowed to that red thread. The nearest hunter lunged. Etta shrieked a warning. The king moved with such speed the eye could not hold him. One hunter hit the shelf and did not rise. Another lost his weapon. The third, face hidden behind a leather half-mask, drove a silver knife towards Severin's side. Aureline did not think. She caught the attacker's sleeve. It was a foolish, mortal movement. It changed enough. The knife tore cloth instead of flesh. The hunter struck Aureline across the shoulder, sending her against the archive table. Her wounded palm hit the open ledger. Blood spread over ink. The black stone beneath the book gave a pulse like a living heart. Light burst upward through the silver veins. Aureline gasped as something rushed through her. Not pain, not exactly, but memory that was not hers. A chapel drowned in moonlight. A king kneeling beside a stone basin. A woman's voice saying, if you bind me, I will not outlive the spring. Another voice, low and breaking beneath discipline, then I will not bind you. She stumbled. The room spun. Severin reached her in the same instant. The last hunter fled through the broken glass door. He caught her against him before she struck the floor. His arm was hard around her back, his other hand enclosed her bleeding one. At the touch, the vision sharpened. She saw his face younger, though not young. Saw blood running through intertwined hands over an altar. Saw him rip the ritual apart with his own mouth set in grief, so severe it resembled cruelty. Saw a woman, her mother. No, someone older from the same line, being carried away under a cloak before dawn. Then the vision broke. Aureline sagged against him, trembling. Severin had not released her hand. The cut across her palm continued to bleed, bright against his pale skin. His expression was stripped bare in a way she had not yet seen. Not hunger, not exactly. Recognition. Etta came toward them, breathless. The rite has answered, it is already moving. Aureline tried to draw back. Severin did not let go. What did I see? She whispered. His gaze stayed on the blood joining their hands. The first binding, he said, and the woman, not your mother. He lifted her injured hand toward his mouth. Aureline went still, not from fear alone but from the solemnity that entered his face. There was no predatory heat in it, no indulgence, only terrible necessity. You are losing too much blood for the mark to remain dormant, he said. If I do not close the wound, the bond will keep pulling. Aureline could not seem to look away. His eyes rose to hers once, as if granting her the dignity of refusal. She gave none, only silence. Severin bent and put his mouth to her palm. The contact was cool first, then burning. The wound sealed under his lips, but not before another sharp current went through her. His loneliness this time, vast and cold as the sea outside the palace walls. And beneath it, a feeling even more dangerous because it had been buried so long. Relief. When he released her hand, the cut was gone. Oraline swayed. His fingers tightened briefly at her waist. Etta stepped back from them both as if she had witnessed a death sentence passed. "It has begun," she said. Oraline looked down. Across the center of her palm, where the wound had been, a faint dark crescent had appeared, like the shadow of a ring. Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. Oraline's blood awakens the ancient soul-binding ritual, and the king seals her wound with blood touch, marking her palm forever. Oraline's hand did not hurt. That unnerved her more than pain would have. The mark across her palm remained faint through the afternoon, visible only when the light caught it slantwise, yet she felt it constantly, not as heat, but as awareness. At odd moments, she knew where Severin stood without turning. Once, while Etta wrapped a linen band around her wrist for appearances' sake, Oraline felt a sudden pressure low in her chest and lifted her head to find the king watching the corridor before the archive door. Alert, listening, as if danger had just entered the palace grounds. A thread, that was what it felt like, fine enough to deny and impossible to cut. "You should tell her everything," Etta said. Severin's reply was quiet. "I will tell her what she must know." The old archivist's gaze passed between them. That is how disasters begin. By sunset, they had moved Oraline into a hidden suite adjoining the ruined chapel where she had spent the night. It had once belonged, Etta said, to a queen who never wore her crown in public. The chamber was severe but not loveless. Dark rose wallpaper faded to ash, a bed hung with old velvet, a dressing table whose mirror had foxed into ghostly silver at the edges. From the narrow balcony, Oraline could see the western cemetery of Noctis descending toward the cliffs. When Severin entered after dusk, she was standing there wrapped in a borrowed black shawl. "You should not remain by the open doors," he said. "Must I ask permission to breathe now?" His expression did not shift. "Only if you intend to do it where arrows can reach you." Oraline almost replied sharply, then heard the truth beneath the austerity and stopped. He shut the balcony doors himself and drew the bolts. She noticed then a shallow tear in the side of his coat where the hunter's knife had grazed him in the archive. "You are wounded." "It is nothing." "It was silver." That made him glance at her. "You noticed," she had. Against her will, she noticed too much about him. The restraint in his hands, the way silence gathered around him not out of emptiness but control. The strange care with which he never stood to, near unless necessity forced it. "Why did my mother refuse?" Oraline asked. That was the question she had been carrying since the archive. Sean stood very still beside the locked balcony doors. Then he said, "Because she understood the right better than those who tried to arrange it." And what is it, exactly? A joining of blood between the throne and a mortal counterline. Once completed, it grants the bond its own law. No rival may lawfully touch what is bound. That sounds like protection. It is. Then why was she afraid? His gaze lowered briefly to Oraline's bandaged hand. Because the right does not preserve mortal life unchanged. The room seemed to draw inward. She would have become a vampire. No, not immediately. That would be simpler. His voice dropped. The bond begins by sharing sensation, then strength, then injury. In time, mortality thins, sleep changes, hunger changes. The body becomes a negotiation between two natures. Oraline felt suddenly cold in the marrow, and if it is left unfinished, it becomes dangerous. How dangerous? Severin met her eyes. One of us could die of what the other does not confess. The words entered the room like a candle being extinguished. Oraline looked away first. Not because she feared him in that moment, but because something in her own heart had become less safely hidden than before. "My mother ran to spare herself," she said after a time. "No," Severin said. There was an unfamiliar weight in his tone, something like memory pressing against old restraint. "She ran," he continued, "because she was carrying you." Oraline turned. For the first time, emotion had escaped his discipline enough to show in full outline. Not wildness. Sorrow. Ancient, honed sorrow. "She came to me the night before the rite was to be completed," he said. "She knew what it would cost. She knew her child had already quickened. She asked whether the bond would touch the life inside her if I went forward." Oraline's lips parted, but no sound came. "I could not guarantee it would not." His hand tightened once behind his back. "So I refused her blood and sent her away before dawn." The chamber blurred for a moment around the edges. "My mother came here to save me. Yes, and you let the court believe House Vale had merely abandoned the old covenant. Yes, why?" His answer was very soft. "Because mercy, in places like this, survives longest when mistaken for indifference." Oraline had no defense against that. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, her composure giving way not to tears, but to something more difficult. Tenderness toward the man who had built his entire throne from misunderstood cruelties. She hated how dangerous tenderness felt. Severin went to the mantel and removed a narrow casket from inside his coat. He set it before her. Inside lay a ring of dark silver set with a black stone. "My mother S?" Oraline asked. "No." His gaze stayed on the ring. "Mine." She looked up sharply. "It was forged for the first completion of the rite," he said. "It has remained unworn since." Oraline did not touch it. "Why show me this?" "Because the council will move soon. They know enough already to suspect. Before they force our hand, you must decide whether you would rather flee this place forever or remain long enough to hear the rest." Oraline stared at the ring. It looked less like ornament than promise, and promises in Noctis had fangs. Before she could answer, a bell tolled from the palace depths, once, twice, 3 times. Severin's face hardened at once. "What is that?" "The council chamber." He turned toward the door. "They are convening judgment." "For whom?" He looked back at her, and though he remained perfectly still, the bond in her palm throbbed like a second pulse. "For us," he said. Cliffhanger/emotional revelation. Oraline learns her mother once came to Severin and fled to save the child she carried, Oraline herself. The council chamber was not the same hall in which Oraline had been rejected. That chamber had been made for spectacle. This one had been made for punishment. It lay in the oldest keep, circular and windowless, with tiers of carved stone rising around a central floor inset in silver lines. 12 high-backed seats formed a ring above, each occupied by a member of the coven's ruling blood. They wore mourning colors so deep they swallowed light. Lady Morcant sat at the king's right hand, austere and unblinking. To Severin's left remained an empty chair draped in black silk, the place once meant for a queen. Oraline stood below with Edda behind her and 2 guards at either side. Severin remained on the upper tier, not yet seated on the throne chair reserved for judgment. The distance between them was deliberate, the room itself accused. "The matter before the coven," Lady Morcant said, "concerns the border daughter Oraline Vale, brought under treaty and found hidden within the king's private wards after a public refusal." A murmur moved through the chamber. Morcant continued, "We ask first whether the king knowingly concealed a mortal claimant after nullifying her presentation." Severin answered without haste. "I preserved a guest of this house from unlawful interference." "Unlawful," said Lord Vere, thin and smiling in the manner of men who enjoyed cruelty because it required so little imagination. "She had not been sealed by any right. No law protected her." Severin's gaze passed over him. "Then perhaps you sent the blades to test the matter." Vere smiled wider, which was answer enough. Oraline kept her chin lowered, though anger burned steady beneath her ribs. She was tired of being discussed as if she were a vessel or a technicality. Yet she said nothing. Words here were snares. Lady Morcant's eyes came to Oraline at last. "Show your hand." Oraline hesitated. Severin said sharply, "No." The single word altered the room. All 12 counselors looked to him. Morcant's pale brows drew together. "Your Majesty!" The king descended the steps, each one quiet as falling ash. When he reached the central floor, he stood not beside Oraline but just before her, a placement that was neither intimate nor deniable. That, he said, is not required. It is now, Morkant replied. If rumor speaks true and blood touch occurred in the archive, the court has a right to know whether the old mark has appeared. Oraline could feel Severin's stillness harden. The bond pulsed once in her palm, answering him. Edda spoke from the rear. And if it has, all heads turned. The archivist did not bow. If the mark has answered, Edda said, then the ancient rite has recognized the counterline. The law is older than this council. You cannot judge the girl as merely mortal property. Veyer gave a cold laugh. Then we should kill her before the law ripens. Severin looked at him. Silence snapped through the chamber so cleanly that even Veyer's smile faltered. When the king spoke, his voice was quiet. Say that once more. No one moved. Oraline knew, suddenly and with startling certainty, that every terrible story ever told about Severin had probably begun in a room like this, with someone mistaking restraint for weakness. Lady Morkant intervened before blood was spilled. The issue is not appetite, she said. It is sovereignty. If the old rite has begun without council sanction, then the king stands in breach of Coven law. Coven law allowed the challenge that nearly killed her, Severin said. Do not invoke your statutes as if they were virtue. Nevertheless, Morkant said, the breach stands. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Oraline felt something strange then, a pressure from the bond not of sensation but memory. The edges of the room blurred. For a heartbeat she saw Severin not as he stood now, but kneeling in this very chamber generations ago. His hand bloodied against the silver floor while the council pronounced a former bond void. Heard someone say, kings may rule, but the coven permits rule. Saw him rise with grief turned into ice. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. She swayed, Severin half turned, noticing at once. And in that turning their eyes met. The chamber saw, Morkant's face went still with comprehension. So, she said softly, the connection has already deepened. No one needed explanation. The air itself had betrayed them. Oraline pressed her marked hand against her skirts, but the concealment was too late. Lady Morkant rose. Then by the authority of the Winter Coven, she declared, Oraline Vale is placed under blood inquiry. Until the next moonrise, she remains under suspicion of illicit binding to the throne. If the rite has indeed begun, it must either be formally sanctioned or severed. Oraline's throat tightened. Severed, no one answered her. It was Edda who finally said, with brutal honesty, by death, if necessary. A brief interlude, Severin's perspective for 600 years. Severin had believed stillness could master anything left alive inside him. He had learned courts, wars, treaties, hunger. He had buried desire beneath law and law beneath silence. He had watched generations of mortal daughters arrive bright with fear or ambition, and had sent them away untouched. He had become, with discipline, precisely the kind of king monsters obeyed, distant enough to revere, merciless enough to trust. Then Oraline Vale had bled in his hands. Now the old chamber smelled of silver and memory, and the council spoke of severing her as though she were no more than a thread they could trim from the tapestry of his reign. He understood with the cold clarity of doom that if they tried, the room would drown. When the moment passed, he was again only the king before them. Lady Morkant lifted her hand. Remove the girl to the north ward. Severin did not step aside. She goes nowhere without me, he said. And for the first time since Oraline had entered Noctis, the council looked not merely wary of its king, but afraid of what he loved. Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. The council discovers the bond has deepened and orders Oraline placed under blood inquiry, where severance may mean death. The North Ward was not a prison in design. It was one in purpose. Once it had housed noble guests too valuable to insult and too dangerous to free. Its chambers were beautiful in the way jeweled knives were beautiful. Rich, no one in the chamber had ever seen Severin disobey the council by standing between its will and its chosen victim. That alone was enough to make fear pass, visible and cold, over ancient faces. Lady Morkant descended from her seat with grave precision, stopping at the silver line that marked the king's authority from the councils. If you refuse blood inquiry, she said, the coven may invoke regency. The throne will be judged compromised. Then judge it, Severin said. A murmur rose like disturbed ash. Oraline looked at him and understood the danger too clearly. He meant it. If they pressed harder, he would break the chamber before he surrendered her to their mercy. It was not only her life now in the balance, but his crown, his house, the fragile peace held together by his long discipline. And still he did not move aside. Strength, Oraline thought, was not always resistance. Sometimes it was the willingness to endure what one most feared. She stepped forward from behind him. My lord, Severin turned slightly, enough for her to see the warning in his face. Do not, he said, but Oraline had spent her life being arranged by other people's decisions. If she was to suffer, then at least once it would be by her own consent. She lifted her head to Lady Morcant. If I submit to the inquiry, will the chamber be satisfied? Morcant's expression gave nothing away. If the inquiry is lawfully conducted. Severin's voice darkened. They will hurt you. Oraline's marked hand trembled once within her sleeve, then stilled. They will hurt more than me if you refuse. Something passed through his eyes then, anger, helplessness, something older and more private than either. Yet in the end, because he had always respected the freedoms of others more fiercely than his own, he did not command her into silence. He only said very low, You do not know what you are choosing. No, Oraline answered, but I know what you are about to lose. The chamber heard that too. Lady Morcant regarded her a long moment. The girl will be kept in the North Ward until moonrise. No blade will touch her without witness. She may retain one attendant. Etta, Oraline said at once. Etta Morven gave no sign of surprise. And her possessions, Oraline added, though her voice almost failed her then. My mother's coffer as well. Morcant inclined her head. Severin looked as though he would rather have argued with fire. Yet he stepped back. It was the closest thing to surrender Oraline had ever seen from him, and because it was for her sake, it felt almost unbearable. The North Ward had once been made luxurious enough to disguise captivity. Tall lancet windows overlooked the cliffs. The hearth burned. The bed was draped in black silk. None of it changed the fact that guards stood beyond the door, silver-lined spears in their hands. Etta remained only long enough to set Oraline's lacquered coffer on the table and say, Read what your mother left before anyone comes for you. Will they truly only inquire? The old woman's face held the sorrow of someone too old to waste comfort on lies. No law written by frightened immortals ever stopped at inquiry if it could reach for cruelty. Then she was gone. Oraline opened the coffer with fingers that would not quite obey her. Beneath the comb and handkerchief lay a packet of sealed pages, the wax brittle with age. Her mother's hand, fine, decisive, covered the first page. If this reaches you, then Noctis has remembered our blood. Oraline sat slowly. You will be told the king is merciless. Believe that he is merciless only where his own heart is concerned. When I went to him, I expected hunger, pride, command. I found a man so governed by restraint that he chose infamy rather than risk the child I carried. If ever the old Mark wakes in you, do not mistake his coldness for lack of feeling. It is the shape his feeling has learned to wear. Oraline pressed the letter to the table as if to keep it from shaking. There was more. If the bond begins, there is only one place where it may be answered without the council's corruption. The sepulchre of the first covenant beneath the western cemetery. I pray you never need this knowledge, but if you do, go before moonrise. After that, the throne itself will hunger for decision. A hard knock struck the door. Oraline folded the page too late. The guards entered with Lord Vere behind them, smiling as though he had been invited to supper. Forgive the interruption, he said. The inquiry has been advanced. She rose at once. Lady Morcant said moonrise. Lady Morcant, Vere replied, has been relieved of that preference. The guards crossed the room. Oraline took one step back, letter still hidden in her hand. Where is the king? Vere's smile sharpened. Occupying himself with those who still imagine him sovereign. The first guard caught her arm. Instantly the mark in her palm burned. Not heat, warning. She was dragged into the corridor, before she could hide the letter anywhere safer than the sleeve of her dress. The North Ward seemed emptied of life. Even the servants had been cleared away. Somewhere deep below, bells were ringing too fast to be ceremonial. They took her not toward the council chamber, but downward, toward the old surgical rooms beneath the keep. Oraline's composure held until she saw the silver instruments laid upon the black table. Veyer moved closer, his elegance curdling into something much more honest. "Do not look so frightened. We need only enough blood to know whether the king will scream when you do." At that, the chamber door behind him opened, not with force, with authority. Severin stood on the threshold, dark as a judgment long delayed. One side of his coat was torn. Blood, someone's, marked his cuff. His face had become so still that it no longer resembled peace at all. The guard at Oraline's side loosened his grip without meaning to. Veyer did not turn immediately. "Ah," he said softly. "Then perhaps we shall know at once." And in Oraline's sleeve, hidden against her wrist, her mother's letter whispered against her skin, "Go to the sepulchre before moonrise." Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. Oraline learns her mother trusted Severin and discovers the hidden place where the bond can be completed or saved. What followed in the surgical chamber happened too quickly for anyone's dignity to survive it. Veyer reached first for the silver blade laid upon the table, perhaps thinking the threat of it would restrain even a king. He had misunderstood Severin in the fatal way cowards always did, mistaking patience for limit. Severin crossed the distance before the blade cleared the tray. The nearest guard hit the wall hard enough to crack stone. The second tried to bar the doorway and found himself flung through it instead. Veyer escaped only because he moved with old instinct and older fear, retreating behind a silver lattice that dropped from the ceiling between himself and the room. Oraline had just enough time to see Severin's bare hand close around the lattice. Silver smoked against his skin. He did not loosen his grip. "Open it," he said. Veyer's composure faltered at last. "If I open it, you will kill me." "Yes." The honesty of that answer filled the chamber like black water. Oraline found her voice first. "Severin." His gaze shifted to her through the silver bars. The violence in him did not vanish, but it bent. That was somehow more terrifying than if it had disappeared altogether. She shook her head once. Not mercy, not for Veyer, for him. Something in his jaw tightened. Then, with effort so severe she could almost feel it through the bond, he released the lattice. The skin of his palm had blistered where the silver burned him. "Come here," he said. She crossed to him at once. He took her wrist, not roughly, and turned her toward the door. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then do not stop." They left the chamber behind with Veyer shouting for the lower guard and no one eager enough to obey quickly. Severin led her not upward, but outward, through the crypt passage beneath the palace and into the western cemetery under storm-dark sky. Rain had begun. The cemetery of Noctis climbed the cliffside in ranks of black stone angels and broken family vaults, all weeping dark mineral streaks down their faces. Lightning moved over the sea without thunder. The air smelled of salt, grave ivy, and oncoming blood. Oraline clutched her mother's letter beneath her cloak as Severin guided her between leaning tombs. He walked as though the cemetery knew him and moved aside. Yet the bond told her what his stride did not. Pain, sharp and growing, from the hand he had burned on the silver. "You are hurt. It will keep. It is worsening." That made him glance at her. "You can feel it now." "Yes," the answer hung between them. The path ended at a mausoleum older than the palace, its lintel carved with 2 circles joined by a line. Severin touched the stone with his damaged hand. Blood, dark and thin, marked the carving. The door opened inward with a sigh. Inside lay a descent of narrow steps winding beneath the cemetery into air, untouched by centuries. At the bottom, a round chamber waited. No sarcophagi, no bones, only a basin of black marble and an altar carved with the same joined circles. Candles rose to life one by one along the walls. Oraline stopped. "This is the place." "Yes." "The first covenant." Severin shut the stone door behind them. Rain vanished. Silence took its place. "For the kings who wish their chosen beyond the reach of their own court." His voice sounded strange here, not louder, but older. Oraline took the letter from her sleeve and offered it to him. He did not take it. My mother wrote that the bond can be answered here without corruption. It can, and if it is, he looked at the altar, not at her. Then the council loses the right to sever us. Us. The word entered her more deeply than it should have. But, she asked, there was always a but in houses built on curse and law. Severin removed his glove from the burned hand. The silver wound had not healed. It ran in an angry line across his palm, reopening the old scar shaped like a ring. But if it is answered fully, he said, your life will no longer be wholly your own. You will feel what harms me. You will draw on my endurance. Time will not leave you untouched in the mortal way. Oraline stared at the wound in his hand and knew, suddenly, what question mattered. What does it cost you? At last he met her eyes. Not at once, not easily, but truly. My immortality would begin to change with yours. How? I do not know. The admission sounded dragged from somewhere ancient and rarely opened. This rite has not been completed in my reign. Because you would not risk it. Because I would not inflict it. The chamber seemed to narrow around the two of them. Oraline thought of his motherless throne, his endless silences, his refusal to call cruelty by any name but necessity. She thought of the night he had publicly rejected her, and the night shadow swiftness with which he had returned when others mistook that rejection for abandonment. Why did you come back for me? She asked softly. His face became unreadable again, but the bond betrayed him, a raw pressure of feeling held too long in chains. Because leaving you there, he said, became impossible. It was not a declaration. It was more dangerous than one. Oraline lowered her gaze because tears would have embarrassed them both. Then tell me what must be done. He did not move. Oraline, she lifted her head, if you ask it of fear, I will refuse you. I am afraid, she said, with the honesty he had taught her. But not of you. Something in him yielded then, not composure, not yet, but distance. Severin stepped to the basin and drew a narrow blade from the altar. He cut the center of his scarred palm. Dark blood welled at once. Then he set the blade down and held his hand over the basin, only held it, waiting. The choice remained hers. Oraline came forward. Her own marked palm trembled once above the black marble. Then, without flourish, without seduction, only with quiet and dreadful willingness, she opened her skin against the same blade and let her blood fall to meet his. The basin answered. Black stone flushed red beneath the mingled drops. Light rose through the joined circles on the altar. The mark in her palm deepened and ran in a dark arc toward her wrist. A vision struck, not of strangers this time, but of Severin alone through centuries of winter halls, empty chairs, treaties signed and broken. The endless discipline with which he had denied himself every tenderness that might become another person's ruin. Then his hand was around hers, not trapping, steadying. You may still stop, he said. Oraline could barely breathe. Can you? His gaze searched her face as though looking there for permission to hope. No, it was answer enough. He lifted her wounded hand, and this time when his mouth touched her skin, it was neither hunger nor rescue. It was vow, sacred and quiet and devastating. The cut sealed. The chamber seemed to exhale. When he raised his head, they stood too near for distance to survive unchanged. Severin's hand came, with astonishing care, to the side of her face. If this is unwelcome, he said, voice nearly gone, tell me now. Oraline did not know how to make boldness from herself. She only knew how to remain, so she remained. That was all the answer he needed. His kiss was brief, reverent, almost sorrowful in its restraint, yet it undid more in her than any violence could have done. It felt less like being claimed than being seen at last, fully, and with unbearable tenderness. Then the altar flared white. A voice not human and not wholly memory moved through the chamber. Before the next moonrise, let the covenant be named before the throne, or the unfinished bond will consume the weaker heart. The light died. Oraline's fingers closed hard around Severin's sleeve. He looked toward the sealed door, already listening to the palace above. Veilleur will move before dawn, he said. Oraline looked at the darkened basin, at the blood they had given, at the future closing its hand around them. "Then we return," she whispered. Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. Oraline and Severin answer the bond in the sepulchre, and learn it must be publicly acknowledged before the next moonrise, or it will destroy her. They return to Noctis by the oldest way, through the funerary tunnels that rose from the western cemetery into the bones of the palace. The storm had broken fully by then. Rain struck the outer walls in sheets. Bells sounded from 3 towers at once, no longer ceremonial but desperate. Somewhere above, the castle had divided against itself. Oraline felt Severin's pain in flashes through the bond. The silver burn, the cost of restraint, the strain of power held too tightly for too long. In return, she sensed he felt the trembling she hid in her hands, the ache left by the right, the fear she refused to give language. Neither spoke of it. The silence between them had changed. It no longer concealed, it accompanied. Etta met them in a reliquary corridor lined with cracked saints. There was blood on her sleeve. "Lady Morkant is imprisoned," she said without preamble. "Veyer has declared emergency sovereignty under Coven law. Half the guard follows him because they fear what the old right may restore." "Hunters?" Severin asked. "At the north gate, let in under truce." "Veyer means to use them, then blame their treachery on you." Oraline's hand tightened around the rail. "Can he do that lawfully?" Etta gave her a bleak look. "In corrupt courts, the law is often only the name given to timing." Severin's face had gone still again, but not with the coldness of before. This stillness had purpose. "How many remain loyal? Enough to die honorably, not enough to hold the palace if the council condemns you." Lightning flashed through the narrow windows. Oraline remembered the warning in the sepulchre. The covenant had to be named before the throne, not hidden, not half-answered, not whispered in catacombs, publicly. Before the very structure that had awakened to her heartbeat. "Then we go to the throne hall," she said. Both of them turned toward her. Etta was first to object. "Child, if we hide now, Veyer decides the meaning of everything." Oraline's voice was quiet, but the quiet had steadied into something stronger than fear. "My blood woke the altar." The covenant answered, "If the law is older than the council, let it speak in its own chamber." Severin watched her a long moment. "You would stand before them again," he said, "after what they made of you." Oraline thought of the hall, the humiliation, the rejection that had been mercy wearing cruelty's face. She thought too of how easily she could flee with him into exile, and of how that would leave the old machinery of harm untouched for some other girl, some later century. "Yes," she said. "If I must." The bond carried his reaction before his face did, not pride exactly, something more dangerous, admiration crossing into devotion. He reached into his coat and drew out the narrow casket he had shown her before. The ring of dark silver lay within it, black stone deep as midnight. "Then no more secrecy," he said. Oraline could not move. Severin took her marked hand. Even now, before Etta, before the lightning and blood and civil fracture, he handled her as though she were something breakable and beloved at once. "This was forged for a covenant the throne never received," he said. "If I place it on your hand now, the court cannot mistake my meaning." Oraline's breath came shallow. "And if they answer with violence," his thumb rested for the lightest instant over the dark crescent in her palm. "Then they answer violence to us both." She should have been terrified. She was. Yet beneath terror, something calm opened. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if memory had been waiting for flesh. The bond surged. Not pain, recognition. Etta looked away first, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because some privacies become unbearable when witnessed. The throne hall was already in uproar when they entered. Veyer stood on the lower dais before the obsidian throne, flanked by armed council guards and 2 hunter captains in ash-gray coats. Lady Morkant knelt at the side, wrists bound in silver. Nobles crowded the edges of the chamber, their elegant stillness broken at last into fear, calculation, astonishment. The hall fell silent when Severin crossed its threshold with Oraline beside him. Not behind him, beside, rainwater darkened the hem of her dress. The black stone on her hand caught the candlelight. She felt every eye upon it like pressure. Veyer smiled with white, bloodless contempt. And here we are, a king with his mortal relic. Severin did not even look at him. He led Oraline straight up the central aisle to the foot of the throne. There he stopped, turned to face the court, and spoke in the voice that had ruled them for centuries. Let witness be taken. Before throne, council, and blood of Noctis, I name Oraline Vale not as tribute, nor claimant, nor vessel. I name her covenant. The hall seemed to inhale. The altar beneath the throne answered at once. Silver ran bright through the floor, the joined circle sigil from the sepulchre lit beneath their feet. Oraline felt the chamber recognize her. Lady Morcant lifted her head sharply. Even bound, she bowed. Veyer's expression broke. This is unlawful, he snapped. The council has not sanctioned completion. The council, Etta said from the hall entrance, is not older than the stone beneath your boots. The hunter captains exchanged glances. They had not expected ritual. They had expected easy murder draped in procedure. Oraline stepped forward before fear could steal her voice. You rejected me in this hall, she said, looking not at Severin but at the gathered court. I know what you believed that meant. I know what many of you intended because of it. Hear me now, I am not hidden, I am not compelled, I stand where I choose. She felt Severin's attention turn wholly to her, terrible in its intensity. Veyer laughed once, harsh and strained. Choice. You speak of choice in a blood court? Oraline met his gaze. Yes. The single word landed harder than his mockery. He drew a blade, not for her, for Lady Morcant. The knife flashed to the bound counselor's throat as Veyer backed toward the throne. Then let choice meet law, he said. By Coven statute, I invoke regal challenge. If the king claims covenant, he defends it in blood. If he refuses, both claim and crown are void. The hunters lifted their weapons. The guards shifted. And beneath Oraline's feet, the altar began to pulse like a waking heart. Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. Before the entire court, Severin names Oraline as his covenant, but Veyer invokes an ancient blood challenge that can cost them both throne and life. Veyer had chosen his moment well. Ancient courts depended less on justice than on spectacle, and blood challenge was the oldest spectacle of all. Once named in the throne hall, it could not be ignored without splintering legitimacy. That was the cruelty of tradition. It forced good men to answer evil on ceremonial terms. Severin stepped down from the lit sigil without releasing Oraline's hand. You will go to Etta, he said quietly. No. His gaze came to her, dark and unshielded. If I fight within the circle while you remain beside me, every wound lands twice. Then do not leave me unguarded with hunters at my back. The truth of that caught between them. He could not deny it. At the far side of the dais, Veyer shoved Morcant away and entered the challenge ring traced in silver before the throne. The hunter captains spread out, not yet moving, waiting to see which old power would fall first. Around the chamber, nobles retreated from the central floor as the silver lines blazed higher. The law is spoken, Veyer called. Let covenant be tested. Oraline felt the bond constrict, not because the challenge itself had power, but because the throne did. The ancient altar beneath the hall had awakened to the unfinished rite. If Severin entered the circle, the covenant would answer through him. If he fell, she understood with sudden certainty, the chamber would try to take its due from her living heart. Lady Morcant staggered to her feet, wrists still bound. Veyer has amended the challenge, she said hoarsely. He's tied the covenant to the throne's severance clause. Etta went white. That clause was struck from the record, not from the stone. Oraline's marked hand burned like iron in a flame. Severin released her at last. Stand back. He entered the ring. The hall changed. The lights guttered low. A wind rose from nowhere, lifting black banners and candle smoke toward the high vaults. Veyer smiled, perhaps thinking the darkness favored him. He had never understood that Severin was most dangerous not in rage, but in the terrible calm that preceded it. The first exchange was almost invisible. Veyer lunged with silver-edged speed. Zangi turned, caught his wrist, and sent him skidding across the ring. Steel rang once. The second strike came higher, meant for the throat. Severin took it on the forearm. Oraline cried out before the blade even touched him, pain tearing hot across her own skin through the bond. Severin heard. He looked at her, the smallest distraction. Enough for Veyer's dagger to cut his shoulder. Oraline felt that too. She gripped the side of the throne steps until stone bit her palms. Endurance, she told herself, not panic, not collapse. If she became another weakness to guard, she would kill him faster than Veyer could. Below, the duel turned brutal. Veyer fought cleverly and without honor, driving Silver wherever Zangi defenses thinned, forcing him to choose between speed and the pain that echoed through Oraline. With each wound, the altar beneath the throne pulsed brighter. The hunters began to move, not toward the duel, toward Oraline. Edda stepped in front of her with nothing but an archivist's knife. Lady Morkant, still shackled, seized a fallen spear and took one hunter through the side before the second struck her down to one knee. Around the hall, loyal guards and traitors collided. The chamber became a violence of silk, silver, blood, and shattering glass. Oraline did not run. She saw, with terrible clarity, what Veyer intended. He did not merely mean to defeat Severin. He meant to overload the unfinished covenant until either the throne severed it through her death or Severin broke his own law to save her and lost everything. The altar beat once more, harder. A memory opened in her, not vision this time, but understanding carried through the answered rite. The covenant's first purpose had not been possession. It had been mutual refusal against the court, a way for king and chosen counterline to place one life above blood politics. The severance clause had been added later, by frightened counselors who could not bear any bond they could not control. The law had been corrupted. Which meant, somewhere beneath corruption, the older law still remained. Oraline left the throne steps. Edda turned, blood on her cheek. "Where are you going?" "To the altar." "Child, no," but Oraline was already moving. A hunter caught at her sleeve. Lady Morkant struck him aside with the shaft of her broken spear. Oraline reached the center dais and dropped to her knees before the obsidian throne, where silver lines converged into a black stone socket like the mouth of a wound. Her marked hand hovered above it. The bond screamed warning. So did Severin. "Oraline," she looked up. Across the ring, Veyer had just driven Severin back one step with a silver cut to the ribs. Blood darkened the king's coat. His face, however, had changed into something more frightening than fury. Not because he was losing, because he was afraid for her. Oraline pressed her palm to the socket. Agony tore through her arm and into her chest. The throne took her blood at once. Silver blazed white through the hall. "I refuse," she said, though her voice broke on the words. "I refuse the corrupted law. I refuse severance by fear. Let the first covenant answer." The chamber shook. Veyer staggered. The hunters shouted. Ancient lines awakened beneath the floor, not the later pattern of control, but a deeper one, wide and joined and merciful in its design. For one heartbeat, everyone in the hall saw it. The original sigil, two circles linked equally, neither enclosing the other. Veyer screamed and lunged for Oraline. Severin moved. A brief interlude. Severin's perspective: he had endured centuries by dividing himself from need. But there was no division left now. Oraline knelt at the throne with blood on her hand and defiance in her breaking voice, and the chamber, the whole corrupt inheritance of it, reached toward her as if she were made to be consumed. He understood then that crown, law, immortality, all of it, were ash beside the fact of her living. So he gave the only thing left that could outweigh the throne: everything. Severin caught Veyer before the blade fell. The force of impact drove them both against the altar rail. Severin's hand closed around Veyer's throat, not killing, holding. Long enough to drag him into the white blaze rising from the reawakened sigil. "You wanted the old law," Severin said, blood at his mouth. "Receive the older one." Then he placed his burned, scarred palm over Oraline S on the throne. Power went through the hall like dawn breaking inside stone. Oraline felt it take him. Not life exactly. Not death. The ancient cold of his immortality, the curse that had preserved him through centuries of solitary rule, pouring into the altar to feed the covenant's true shape. The throne cracked. The silver challenge lines shattered. Veyer cried out once and was flung backward into darkness that closed over him like water over a dropped blade. Then the light collapsed. Severin fell. The hall went silent except for rain and the dying hiss of broken silver. Oraline turned, catching him before his head struck the stone. He was pale even for him, still, too still. The bond, once a taut dark thread, had become suddenly quiet, and beyond the shattered windows, dawn had begun to gather. Cliffhanger / emotional revelation. To save Oraline and destroy the corrupted covenant law, Severin sacrifices the very immortality that defined him and falls motionless in her arms. At first Oraline thought silence meant death. The throne hall had never known true silence before. It had always held the residue of law, ambition, fear, the long whisper of old hungers dressed as governance. But now those things seemed broken open. The cracked floor no longer glowed. The obsidian throne had split along one arm. Silver challenge lines lay dull as old frost. Around the chamber, survivors stood as though unsure whether they had witnessed a coup, a miracle, or the ending of an age. Oraline knelt in the wreckage with Severin's head against her lap. Severin, no answer. There was blood at his temple, blood on his mouth, blood where silver had torn him. Yet none of that frightened her as much as the absence she felt through the bond. It had not vanished. It had changed into something fainter, stranger, quieter, no longer the immense cold sea of an immortal king, but something far more fragile. A pulse, weak, human-slow. Lady Morkant, limping and gray with pain, reached them first. She stopped short when she saw Oraline's face, and perhaps wisely, did not attempt comfort. He lives, Oraline said, though saying it felt like prayer rather than certainty. Etta knelt on Severin's other side and placed 2 fingers at his throat. For the first time since Oraline had known her, the old woman looked honestly astonished. He has a heartbeat. The words struck the chamber with the force of a verdict. Somewhere behind them, one of the remaining nobles dropped to both knees. Another followed. Not out of reverence, Oraline thought, but because they no longer knew what else a king was if not what Severin had just chosen not to be. He gave the throne its due, Morkant said quietly. And took something else in exchange. Oraline looked down at Severin's face. Without the ancient stillness animating him, he seemed not lesser, but younger in some grave and impossible way. The hardness carved by centuries had not disappeared. Yet mortality, if this was mortality, had touched him already with a different kind of vulnerability. Rain lightened at the shattered windows. The first ash-colored edge of dawn entered the hall. The old Severin would have burned in direct sun. Now the pale light reached his hand where it lay across Oraline's skirts, and though his skin reddened faintly, it did not char. She almost wept then from sheer relief. Instead she bent and pressed her forehead to his. "Come back," she whispered. "You returned for me that night. You do not get to leave me at dawn." The bond stirred, small, faint, but answering. His lashes moved. The entire hall seemed to draw breath as one. Severin's eyes opened slowly, as though waking from not sleep but depth. For a moment he looked at the cracked ceiling with bewilderment so slight only Oraline would have seen it. Then his gaze found her, and changed, not to possession, not to awe. To a kind of wonder so carefully contained it almost broke her heart. "You are alive," he said. His voice was roughened by blood, and something else. Frailty, perhaps, or the shock of breath coming differently than before. Oraline let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not trembled. "Yes." He tried to rise. Immediately pain crossed his face. Oraline put a hand to his shoulder. "Do not." The corner of his mouth shifted with an echo of old severity. "I am in the throne hall. You shattered the throne hall. That is not," he murmured, "an improvement in protocol." Even Morkant made a small, disbelieving sound that might once have been amusement. Servants were sent, the wounded were carried out, the dead were covered. The hunter captains who survived were given over to the dungeons below, where, for the first time in Noctis, they would not be able to claim lawful invitation into vampire politics. Veyer was nowhere found. Not body, not blade, only a dark scorch at the foot of the broken altar, as if the older law had decided to keep what it was owed. By noon, the council had reconvened in a smaller chamber, stripped of ceremony. Severin attended seated, pale and bandaged, with Oraline beside him, and no one bold enough to object. The outcome, once impossible, now unfolded with terrible simplicity. The severance clause was declared void. Blood challenge against unconsenting mortals was abolished. The ancient covenant law was restored in its first form, mutual, witnessed, uncoerced. And because the throne itself had been transformed by Severin's sacrifice, the crown of Noctis could no longer compel a mortal line by treaty. The old machinery had broken at last. Then came the final matter. Lady Morcant stood before the diminished council and bowed her head. "Your Majesty, the throne remains yours if you wish it." Severin was silent a long moment. Oraline felt through the gentler bond the weight of centuries in him, the whole lonely architecture of rule, duty worn into identity, sacrifice so habitual it had become language. Then she felt something else, new and quiet and almost tender. Choice. When he spoke, the chamber listened as if hearing him for the first time. Noctis requires a ruler raised for the shape it must become next. I was made for what it was. His gaze moved briefly to Oraline. And I have spent too long confusing endurance with life. Morcant lowered her eyes. She understood. So did Etta. The regency would pass for a time to the restored council under reformed law, until a successor from the elder houses could be named without blood coercion. It was messy, uncertain. Mortal, in the political sense, Oraline thought that might be the healthiest thing that had ever happened to Noctis. That evening, as the storm finally cleared, she found Severin in the ruined chapel beneath the palace, the same place where he had hidden her after his public rejection. When all this had still looked like danger without shape. He stood by the narrow sea window, coat dark against the paling sky. A bandage crossed his left hand. Another disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. He turned when she entered, and the motion was subtly different now. Not slower exactly, but governed by body rather than curse. "It seems," he said, "I can no longer hear threats through 6 walls." Oraline came to stand beside him. "Is that difficult?" "Yes." After a pause, he added, "and peaceful." Below them, the sea struck the cliffs in long silver lines. Evening deepened. Soon the first stars would appear. Severin looked at her hand where the dark ring rested. "If you wish freedom now," he said, voice quiet, "I can offer it truthfully. The bond remains, but the law does not hold you." "You owe me nothing." Oraline had waited, perhaps from the first night, to hear him finally speak without hiding tenderness inside renunciation. She turned toward him, the chapel dim and salt-cold around them. "You returned for me when you could have let the world misunderstand you," she said. "You gave up a throne that misunderstood you for centuries. If I remain, it is not debt." His face changed in that rare, devastating way it did when truth struck beneath all his defenses. "It is not," he asked. "No." She did not step into his arms. She had never been made for boldness, but she stood near enough that the invitation existed between them. He crossed it. Very gently, as though the gesture itself were a thing newly permitted, Severin drew her against him. She felt the beat of his altered heart beneath her cheek, quiet, astonishing, real. The kiss he gave her then held no urgency at all. Only devotion, grief survived, and the grave sweetness of 2 people who had nearly lost each other before they were allowed to begin. When at last he rested his brow to hers, the dying light from the sea touched his face without burning him. "What becomes of us now?" Oraline whispered. Severin looked out toward the darkening coast, where the border lands lay beyond storm and memory. "We go where no one can purchase your blood with law," he said. "And where I may learn, however late, what life is when it is not only endured." It was not a promise of ease. It was better. It was a promise of truth. So before full night fell, the former king and the girl he had once publicly rejected left Noctis by the western road, carrying no crown between them, only a dark ring, a quiet bond. And the first fragile shape of a future neither had been permitted before. And behind them, High on the cliff, the old palace watched them go like a thing finally taught to release what it could not rightfully keep. Final emotional resolution. Severin survives transformed, gives up the crown, and leaves Noctis with Oraline, not as king and vessel, but as two souls finally choosing one another, beyond the reach of corrupt law.